again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic for you today, a dark one. Let's do it. Serious. What is the most shocking thing you've ever seen? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. About 6 years ago, my family was traveling to Pennsylvania to visit some relatives for Easter, and we drove back on Easter Sunday afternoon. We were driving on I-81 South in Virginia and noticed traffic was slowing down and smoke coming from the side of the road. A car had crossed over the median and hit another car head-on. Both cars were beyond totaled and were engulfed in flames. I remember looking over at one of the cars and seeing a person in the passenger seat, and a good chunk of their head was missing, and the driver appeared to be dead too. I looked it up on the news the next day, and only one person survived out of the 5 people involved in that crash. It was a pretty ugly scene, to put it mildly. Working at a special care home had a resident who routinely screamed for help over minor things. "Help! I need my lights off," kind of thing. One night, she fell alone in her room and split her face open above her eye. Instead of calling for help, she just quietly walked out into the common area at 3 a.m. looking like Carrie. It was my first time applying my first aid knowledge and my first time calling 911. Most unforgettable was the sight of her blood-covered rosary. Woman really looked like a movie crew had made her up. There was a case in the UK recently where a couple abused their son to the point where he died. During the court case, they showed video that was taken in the home. I believe the video was taken the day before he was killed. The boy was really young, extremely malnourished, and in a room by himself crying, just talking to himself about how nobody loves him. I'm a 37-year-old man and a new dad. I basically spent the rest of the day crying. It devastated me to think about this kid thinking no one loves him, being abused, not knowing he was going to be dead the next day. Even now, the memory of the video comes back every now and then and just ruins me. There's no punishment appropriate enough for people who do that to children. I walked in on my sister as soon as she pulled the trigger of the gun to kill herself. I was only 6 at the time and didn't know what she did, but she stopped moving and wouldn't respond to me. When Mom came, I could tell she tried her hardest not to cry in front of me. She just told me to go in my room and play Wii. An hour or so later, she came and told me about what suicide and all that other stuff was, and that's when I realized I'm never going to see my sister again. I was walking down a neighborhood where a number of homeless people are insane, but most of the time I just mind my own business, walking to where I work. But one day I saw a person eating his own human waste. I was mind-boggled. Later, when I was heading back to my home, I saw him at the same area, so I decided to give some leftovers I got from the shop I was working. Man, he was the happiest person I saw when I gave him the food. Went to visit my grandfather and found him lying in the front doorway covered in blood and barely conscious. I had dealt with emergency situations before, but this made me freeze up. Managed to tell my wife not to get our son out of the car and to get his neighbor, a nurse, then called an ambulance and tried my best to make him comfortable. Doctor at the hospital said a heart issue made him collapse, and there was no saving him once that had happened, but he laid alone through the night and halfway through the next day, conscious but unable to move. It's been 3 years, and I still feel guilty for not visiting sooner, and wonder if I had done things differently, would he still be here? I still think about going to visit him or calling him before remembering he's gone, and every time I think about him, that is what I see. I mean, coming from a relative stranger, I could just say there's really not much you could have done except what you did, so you did everything you could and you did the right thing. Sometimes things just happen, so sorry for your family's loss. I was 8, woke up to my younger brothers, 5 and 6, screaming, "Mommy is dying, help!" I ran to her bedroom to see her choking on her own blood, and it was everywhere. It soaked her pillow, dripped down her face, throat, and chest. She was still shaking from having a seizure. She'd bitten her tongue so hard it had to get stitches. This was the first one she'd had. My brothers and I could barely move her onto her side because She was at least 300 pounds. I remember getting her blood all over my hands. I called 911 and they said she would have choked to death if my brothers didn't get me in time. You know how my mom thanked us? She got pissed I called 911 and yelled at me saying how awful of a child I was for wasting her money on an ambulance. You know, hearing the noises she made hacking it up, the lifeless look in her eyes, it stays with you, especially as a child. She refused to ever get me therapy for it. I couldn't talk on the phone for years after that incident. I would get panic attacks thinking about what happened. As an adult, I started having these seizures too, so it's just a constant reminder of her, my toxic mother. About 2 or 3 years ago, my fiance and I were stood in the kitchen cooking dinner. I was stood by the counter talking to her whilst she was stood over the hob frying. She started slowly lowering herself closer and closer to the flaming hobs to the point I interjected and panicking said, "What are you doing?" For her to slowly turn her head towards me with the blankest of gazes and then proceeded to collapse onto the hobs. Thankfully, I managed to jump in and pull her away from receiving any burns, but she collapsed to the floor and was out for a good 30 seconds. I thought she was dead. I'll never forget that look in her eyes too. Really felt like it was over. I used to work in a military hospital, nowhere near any live action, but I did see everything from dead babies to amputations to CPR on a botched surgery patient who certainly wasn't going to make it. I can name a ton of things. But the one thing that stands out happened when I was just 6 years old. I was in kindergarten on recess. A boy grabs me and says he wants to show me something. He takes me to a small hidden spot on the playground, and him and another boy start performing oral sex on each other, 5 or 6 years old. I ran off and told the teacher, but now that I'm an adult, I realized that something was terribly wrong at home. We lived in an effed up world. Battle of Fallujah, November 2004. I was a medic, was locked in the back of a Bradley fighting vehicle for 12 to 15 hours, and was finally let out to stretch my legs and pee. Looked up and saw a guy running to the opposite riverbank. He sees us and turns to run. Then a shot rings out from a 25mm cannon and a high explosive round hits him right in the butt cheek. He burst into pink mist, except for his left foot and shin, which wobbled back and forth before falling over like an effing cartoon. It was like I was standing next to him, but he was 275 to 300 yards away. I stood there with my dick in my hand and piss on my boot. I can still see it, plain as day. In person, accident between an idiot in a Camaro and a moron on a bike, motorcycle. Camaro, genius, was trying to turn left across 3 lanes of bumper-to-bumper traffic. Just as someone let them through, guy on bike came flying down the right side berm. Biker was not wearing any gear, just shorts, shirt, sneakers, and sunglasses. Guy got massively lucky though. If he'd hit a regular car or SUV, he would have gone splat right against the side of the car. But the Camaro was so low sling, he just got vaulted over the top. He was in a world of hurt, but apparently in one piece. And video? I'm a racing fan, so it'd be a tie between the fatal accident of Roger Williamson or Tom Price in F1 and Gordon Smiley and Greg Moore in IndyCar. All can be found on YouTube, but consider this a big warning. They are not for everyone. Williamson burned to death while trapped upside down in his car at Zandvoort, despite the efforts of fellow driver David Purley. Tom Price hit a track marshal who was crossing the track. The fire extinguisher the marshal was carrying struck Price in the head and killed him instantly. Smiley had a catastrophic crash during qualifying for the 1982 Indy 500. He reacted incorrectly and ended up going straight into the wall at 200 miles per hour, 320 kph. In photos of the wreck, you can see his helmet go flying. Part of his head is still in it. Moore was killed after losing control during a race at Fontana Speedway in 1999. Ultimately, he was launched sideways and headfirst into a cement barrier. The impact was recorded by the car's black box at 154 Gs. Yes, extremely lucky that that person on the bike got up and lived through that. That's crazy. Like, I've seen a lot of violence, but typically then my blood is up and it doesn't faze me. The most shocking thing I've seen was when I was catching a bus into the city. It was diverted and we had to get off. Annoying. Then we looked down the road and about 100 meters away, a whole crane had collapsed onto the building it was helping to construct. It didn't look real. It looked like something from a movie or a computer game. Things like that don't tend to happen where you can see them, you know? Everybody thinks reporting is kind of an interesting profession, chiefly because journalists love to say self-congratulatory things about their work. In truth, it's kind of seedy, low-paying, and stressful with terrible hours and constant exposure to the worst things in society. This is why so many reporters become cynical burnouts with bad marriages and substance abuse issues. When I was a freshman and sophomore in college, I worked as a cub reporter for the morning paper. I was always being sent out to cover murders, shot house raids, and car wrecks. When I landed the gig straight out of high school, I thought, yeah, I'm gonna be a reporter. Ooh boy. I was a sheltered, middle-class white kid from the suburbs, thinking he was going to see what life was really about. The time I saw the aftermath of a wreck was the worst. According to the estimate of the police on the scene, the guy was doing 80 when he hit the end of a guardrail and plowed it up. Somehow, the end of it went through his windshield and decapitated him, except for a single tendon holding his head on. His eyes were open. I went behind the police car and threw up. Nightmares for weeks. Then, there was the time when a photographer and I were coming back from an assignment when some teenaged girl was raped in a bad part of town. She ID'd her assailant, and the police found him in a seriously iffy neighborhood. We raced over there to get the story, only to find ourselves and 3 squad cars being surrounded by an angry mob. One guy decided to try his luck and snuck up on an officer with a lead pipe, who turned around just in time and laid the guy out. I knew it was getting bad when the police started pulling the street sweepers out of their trucks. This was the early 80s. I'm fully convinced that had the police officer not turned around in time, the crowd would have gone nuts and I would have had my ass kicked, or worse. But I finally quit reporting after another assignment. A kid from a wealthy suburb came home from college at Christmas, walked into the room where his dad kept the shotguns, and blew his head off. Because I was all of 19, the editor thought it would be a good idea if I talked to the father because he might relate to me more. So here I am, 19, and having to ask the poor father if he knew why his son killed himself. I felt so freaking dirty doing it. I wrote the story, and the managing editor wanted to know why the hell I didn't learn why the kid offed himself. I asked him point blank, who really needs to know that information? I had a lot of guts for a kid. After that, I quit the job and worked for a bookstore. Paid less, but felt better. Reporting was that damaging to my soul. I was at my college when a school shooting took place. Time slowed down. While we sat hunkered down in our class, wondering if this was it, usually calm classmates and friends cried when the body count started getting announced on international news, and I was flooded with the "Are you okay?" messages from friends and acquaintances far and wide. It permanently changed how I felt about my home country and how I perceived some other things as well. I was at an illegal warehouse rave once, having a great time, and then out of nowhere, these dudes savagely attacked a man with a claw hammer. Apparently he kicked one of their dogs, but I was stood right next to them and never saw anything like that happen. The dude that was attacked kinda ran off through the crowd, but me and a friend found him about 5 minutes later, laying in the biggest pool of blood I've ever seen, curled up behind a wall, obviously close to death. I had to go over to the DJs and tell them to stop the music and immediately call an ambulance, because the dude was gonna die otherwise. It meant the rave had to stop, obviously, because ambulances and so many police cars rushed to the scene, but it had to be done. It was such a horrible thing to see. Never saw so much blood in my life. I mean, it's all fun and games at the illegal warehouse rave until somebody gets hit with the backside of a claw hammer, but you did the right thing, and the party had to stop. I was a middle school teacher, 7th grade. I told a parent I thought her child had a learning disability, dyslexia, during parent-teacher conferences and recommended testing. The school would facilitate it, and her kid would be set up before high school. Her response was to smack her kid so hard the dean ran in thinking a kid had put his hands on an adult. The worst thing? The kid just sat there. He was just so used to it. It became a big thing above my head immediately, and I was instructed to never bring it up to the student, but I felt so guilty. That kid needed help and support, not abuse. You can't smack away a learning disability, but you can create lifelong trauma. When I was younger, I was driving home from a party. It was about 2 a.m. on I-95, and I came around an S-curve to find a vehicle turned sideways in the shoulder, engine blowing out steam, fenders and hood all kinked up. I stopped my truck, which my dad had gotten from some town management agency, and orange GMC with flashing yellow lights on top. I turned on the lights so traffic coming around the S-curve would be aware. Then I went to see who was in the car. A young black female, late 20s, in a dress with flowers on it, had stepped out from the passenger side. She was screaming and crying. I looked in through the passenger door and saw the driver, a black male, also late 20s, wearing a blue button-up shirt. He was conscious. His eyes were open and I spoke to him. I asked if he was okay. His head was trembling a bit, as if it were too heavy for his neck. I saw blood dripping onto his shirt from the side of his face I couldn't see. He didn't answer me. I noticed the location where a seatbelt connects, on the side of the frame above the seat. It was bare metal. The plastic shroud had been removed or fallen off or broken. There was blood on it. I asked the man to look at me so I could see his eyes. After a brief pause, he blinked and began to turn to look at me. As he turned, the blood increased in flow, and when he made eye contact with me, I could see that the other side of his head was injured. I ran around to the driver's side and saw that the seatbelt bolt, which held it to the frame, had broken the man's skull, and his brain was protruding through the wound. I had already called the police before getting out of my truck, and I waited with the two, holding the man's hand while his girlfriend sat in the passenger seat holding his other hand. When I saw flashing lights, I told him I would pray for them, then left. I was 18 and a little intoxicated, plus my truck had no insurance. I could see the ambulance arrive in my rear view as I hightailed it. About 2 weeks later, I drove past the spot in daylight and I saw that a cross had been painted in the dirt by where the car sat. The man's picture was stapled to the cross with rosary beads, candles, and other mementos. It was heartbreaking. I can still see the woman's face as she cried for my help in her dress with flowers on it.